Okay, guys, welcome back. What is this? Week 6, week 7? We are now dealing with World War One. World War One. Let's get some basics out of the way, and then we'll talk about events leading up to that war. The years of World War One are 1914 to 1918. The United States will not get involved in that war until April of 1917, so we do get in late. But our entry is decisive. We bring in manpower, bring in equipment, and really have a lot to say with the end of the war and who's going to win, and we'll talk about that. Where to start with something like this? First of all, when we call it a world war, well, it's not like World War II, where you had major battles fought all over the world. World War One is really a European conflict that becomes a world war primarily because of empires and because of the late entry of the United States. But it's essentially a European conflict. The causes of the war are primarily European, and most of the most important battles will all be fought in Europe. Let's start with this. Let's go back to 1870, and let's talk about a war that may be at least, if not the root reason, certainly one of the major precursors to the war. In 1870, Germany, there was no German nation. There were about 30 separate German states. And amongst these German states, the most powerful and the richest and certainly the most militaristic was the Prussian state. Prussian state was ruled by King Frederick William and his chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck ran Prussia. Frederick William was really not a powerful king in the sense of getting involved in things. Bismarck ran things. And Bismarck's dream was to create a united Germany under Prussian rule. By 1870, he was prepared to do this. Through peaceful means and military means, he'd managed to cobble together an economic alliance, most of the German states, and was about to unify these German states under one rule. The one nation in Europe that opposed this, the strongest opposition to this, was France. In 1870, Prussia and France went to war over this question, something called the Franco-Prussian War. The Prussians defeated the French in about 6 weeks, causing the collapse of the French government and causing the unification of Germany. The German nation was created in 1871. Bismarck went from being a Prussian nationalist to being a German nationalist, doing everything he possibly could to try to protect the new German state. Of all the nations in Europe that certainly had it out for the new German state would be France. And so part of Bismarck's diplomacy, what's later be called his web of diplomacy, Bismarck signed secret and public treaties and agreements, dozens of them over the years, primarily designed to isolate France. His reasoning being this: of all the nations in Europe who would want to destroy the new German nation, that would be France. Well, how do we deal with that? Well, we think we can handle France. If Prussia defeated France in 6 weeks, certainly the whole German nation could defeat France. However, if France were to get allies, this could be a problem. And in particular, of all the allies that might create the biggest problem, would be Russia. If Russia and France got together, we're talking about a two-front war. Germany would have to fight on two fronts, splitting up the military. That's something that Bismarck saw as a problem. And so he spent much of the next 20 years trying to isolate France through diplomacy. But being certainly a careful man, he decided also to prepare for the inevitable. If something were to happen, if war were to happen, inevitable, but if war were to happen, what do you do? So it's a what-if plan. All governments have what-if plans. What if Martians land? What do we do? So forth and so on. A what-if plan was, worst-case scenario, we get a two-front war, what do we do? In 1884, he sends that to the German staff. Come up with a plan where we can solve this problem. And they come up with something called the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan's in your notes. The Schlieffen Plan was essentially an idea that we could knock out France and then return our military to the east in time to defeat Russia. Now, this is based on this assumption here. Russia probably had the largest army in Europe, but it was also technologically backward. It took a long time for the Russians to mobilize their full army. As it turns out, close to 6 weeks. So the idea was, if we can knock out France and then get our army back within 6 weeks, The Russians will just be mobilizing their full army, and we'll be able to then fight them so we can avoid a two-front war. How do you do that? You build railroads across Germany going east and west. During peace, you use them for trade and business. During war, you move your troops west, knock out France, get them back on the trains, move them east in time to face the slow-moving Russians. If you hit France, you're going to hit defenses. That's going to slow the timetable down. The timetable on the Schlieffen is very important in World War I, guys, so please be aware of it. We got 6 weeks, essentially. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, the Schlieffen Plan originally said we'll break through the French defenses. But an addendum was added to this. An addition was added to this that said, as insurance, let's send part of our army through Belgium. Now, Belgium was neutral, north of France, but its neutrality was guaranteed by Great Britain. So the idea was that if you mess with Belgium, Great Britain is going to be your enemy. You're going to have to deal with them. But Germany, the Schlieffen Plan said, what we'll do is we'll go through Belgium to the north, lightly defended, then head through France from the north. We'll do it quickly. We won't actually invade or conquer much of Belgium, but we'll be able to move down from the north into France. That way, we can get to Paris more quickly. That was the basic plan. Now, remember the Schlieffen Plan, right? In 1890, Frederick William died, and his son, William Frederick, or we know him as the Kaiser Wilhelm, took over. Kaiser, a very intelligent man, but also a very autocratic man, a man who saw most problems through military eyes, believed that the German military and navy could handle any problems in foreign affairs, and really didn't think that Bismarck's web of diplomacy made a lot of sense. So he fired Bismarck and did not re-sign any of the treaties, well, except for a couple. One being the dual alliance, something that Bismarck had signed with Austria in 1882. The dual alliance was an agreement, economic and political, military, between Austria and Germany to side with each other in cases of crisis and help each other. That's the one important treaty that the Kaiser did re-sign and allowed to be re-signed. But most of them went to the wayside. We're now getting to the end of the 19th century, and we're going to have to shift gears here. So let's go out of Western Europe, and I know we haven't spoken about Britain yet, but we will. Let's get out of Western Europe and let's go down into Eastern Europe. At the end of the 19th century, Eastern Europe was still part of what was called the Ottoman Empire, a Turkish Islamic empire that ran all the way from North Africa to the Middle East through its capital in Istanbul, in Turkey, and right into Eastern Europe. It was a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that had become extremely weak by the end of the 19th century. Many other larger, more powerful nations had their eyes on Ottoman territory, particularly in Eastern Europe. Russia had fought against Western powers to try to cut a piece of Eastern Europe away in something called the Crimean War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, major empire in Central Europe, had its eyes on Eastern Europe. And the weaker the Ottomans became, the more that these countries looked on Eastern Europe as an opportunity. In 1902, there was a rebellion in Turkey, what was being called at the time a liberal rebellion. The younger officers of the Turkish military had risen up, and they had overthrown the older military ruling class. We used to have a term called when the younger echelon would take over, we'd say the Young Turks took over. We don't use that saying much anymore, but that's really where it comes from. They professed they're going to be a progressive, secular revolution. For many people in Eastern Europe, that meant freedom, it meant independence. But very quickly, after the victory, the Young Turks made it clear that they had no intention of giving up empire. And now those people in Eastern Europe became even angrier. We were talking about people like Greeks, Bulgarians, Romanians, Serbians, Croatians, Macedonians, Albanians. All these people, ethnic groups, all hearkened for their own independent nations and states. By the end of the 19th century, the only one that really had managed to do this was Serbia. But Serbia was a landlocked country. And it had great ambitions, great nationalist ambitions. And if you're going to be a great nation in the 19th, early 20th century, a global nation, you need a navy. In order to have a navy, you need beachfront property. Serbia had neither. So they had their eyes on chunks of Eastern Europe that had coastline. Um, in 1905, Russia and Austria decided that they would sign an agreement called the Buchlau Agreement, Buchlau, in which a secret agreement, in which they promised that they would help each other achieve their separate goals in Eastern Europe. What did they want? Russia wanted a strip of land, would take them to the Mediterranean, help them have access to the Mediterranean. Austria-Hungary wanted Serbia and Herzegovina. Serbia and Herzegovina, it's in your notes. Two nice beach-free property that Austria wanted. They agreed to help each other. But very quickly, soon after signing this agreement, Austria-Hungary decided to simply take Serbia and Herzegovina without Russian help. The Russians immediately demanded an investigation. They called outright imperialism by Austro-Hungary, knowing, of course, that the Buchlau Agreement was a secret agreement, so it wasn't going to be made public. In 1908, a conference was held of the European powers to decide what's going to happen with this. This was the Berlin Conference, 1908. At the Berlin Conference, the more powerful nations in Europe, those who were interested, sided with Austro-Hungary. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and particularly Germany, sided with the Austrians. Russia left angry, upset, but there was another nation that had gone to that conference who had expected maybe to get some land out of this, and that was Serbia. They thought they should have Serbia, Herzegovina. Nobody listened to Russia, and they certainly weren't going to listen to Serbia. The result was that Serbia and Russia left the Berlin Conference with common angst, common anger, and that often creates close relationships, which it did. In 1911, the East European ethnic groups with Serbia joined and unified in a war against Turkey called the First Balkan War, and they defeated Turkey in 1911. After the war, they signed a treaty, the Bucharest Treaty, and the treaty was to split up territory so that every group would have their own boundaries and nations. But soon after signing this treaty, many of these new nations became angered by what they thought was too much of a good deal for the nation of Bulgaria, which they thought it had too much land. And so these East European groups, nations, allied with Turkey, as it turns out, declared war on Bulgaria. And in 1913, they fought the Second Balkan War. Bulgaria was defeated. But in the peace conference of Bucharest, 1913, Bulgaria did not lose much land. In fact, it's a very strange treaty. But the main thing that came out of it is that Bulgaria lost the war, but didn't really lose territory. And Serbia, despite being on the winning side again, did not end up with any beachfront property, so they could have a navy and become a world power. Many Serbs, Croatians, others ambitious groups within Eastern Europe began to think that maybe their nationalist ambitions were being prevented by the Austro-Hungarians, and to a degree they were right. The Austro-Hungarians had a lot of influence in these Bucharest conferences in determining the outcome. There were many groups, particularly in Serbia, nationalist groups, who were very proud of their nation and their people, and they had spread their culture around Eastern Europe, around the world to share it. But others had done so in a more violent, underground way. Many groups had decided that the only way that they were really going to forward Serbian power or Croatian power was to make Austria, to punish Austria. There were many of these, what we would call terrorist groups, organized. One of these groups was called the Black Hand. The Black Hand was organized as a terrorist group, specifically to punish Austria and to forward Serbian and Croatian ambitions. In 1914, the Black Hand decided that the way they were going to punish Austria was by assassinating the heir to the Austrian throne, a man named the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And in 1914, he was assassinated by the Black Hand. The result of this was that Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, decided to use this as an opportunity to finally crush Serbia and crush Croatia. So they sent an ultimatum to Serbia. after they found out who the assassins were, and said, you will do the following. This ultimatum did things like put judicial power under the Austro-Hungarians in Serbia, had the Austro-Hungarians control or determine the military fate of Serbia. It was really very, very restrictive. And like most ultimatums, it really wasn't meant to be followed. It was meant to be an opportunity for war. We'll get right back to that.